Hello, I'm Yoni, and I'm really pleased that you could join me today. I'm gonna just give a couple of seconds just to check we're live. Yeah, brilliant. So welcome. As I say, I'm Yoni, and I want to tell you a little bit about myself, and then talk about transracial adoption. Um, but first of all, just if you have any questions, be great to hear from you, and do put them in the. I'll take one of those out. To put them in the comments, and I'll be happy to try and address them. Also, if you're on and you want to comment, do put if you give StreamYard permission to show your name, then it'll show your name. If you prefer to keep anonymous, that is absolutely fine. It will show Facebook user. And also, any of comments or both when you're live or in the group later on will only be shared with group members. So that's the admin. Um, I'm wanting to talk to you about transracial adoption, and it's something that I've sort of been wanting to talk about, but also been a bit nervous about, if I'm really honest. Partly because it's something that's really close to my heart, and also partly because I think it can create quite a lot of emotions from a lot of people, and people have got quite strong feelings about transracial adoption, and sometimes people can be a little bit critical, certainly in some Facebook groups that feel sometimes like it's not an easy thing to talk about. And so I want to say that this is a safe space. This group is one where I think no questions are silly question or a negative question. It's just about us learning together and sharing experiences. So, who am I? And for those who don't know, I am Yoni. I'm a social worker, and I'm also an adopted person, and I've also adopted myself. So, just to give you a little bit of background, I was born in Southampton, and I was born to a woman who was actually third generation of girls brought up in residential care. And my father, she believed, was an American seaman, and I've grown up thinking that my father was an American seaman, and I only just sort of reread some of my information to find that possibly she wasn't quite sure, but that's who I am. I went to a number of foster carers before moving to my foster carers for respite, Kath and Ron. And really, luckily for me, they decided to adopt me, and I'm grateful for them for all the many opportunities that I had that I probably wouldn't have had, or I know I wouldn't have had. But I did grow up as a black child in a pretty exclusively white world, and I stood out, and did experience, particularly as I got older, bullying and name calling, and it was quite hard to maintain a sort of sense of my own identity and to feel positive about that, really. Um, so that experience really came to teach me that I really wanted to take an approach that everyone should be treated fairly, and regardless of where they come from, the colour of their skin, sexuality, their religion, or their abilities. It's really fundamental value for me to live by, to treat people not necessarily the same, but fairly. And so I've worked with children in care, foster carers, adopters for the past 30 years, actually. And I've been determined really to give young people as many opportunities as possible. And that's really been reinforced by my experience working with young people in care who are leaving care for the first time, especially those who have been in residential placements or foster placements, because they come out with very little family networks, resources, or support. And so that's why really I'm a passionate advocate of adoption, because I think if the young person or child cannot remain with their birth family, adoption is the next best alternative. And I've adopted two girls. They're now 19 and 18, and my civil partner and I have benefited from advice and guidance, but I think we've also been aware that there were some things that we could have done differently or we could have done better. Um, so what I wanted to talk to you about really was transracial adoption and some of the ideas that I think I've been talking to adopters and through my social work experience are really good ideas to think about, particularly if you're at the beginning stages, maybe thinking about whether this is a possibility for you or not. Um, in an ideal world, every child would be placed with a family that represented and shared their background. But that that isn't always possible. And what when you take on that responsibility, what its aim, hope I would expect, is that families try and maximise the information that they have about the child's background. And I guess in COVID and the discussions that we've had around COVID and Black Lives Matter, people are being very alive to race and racism. But there's a lot of shame and resistance and difficulty in talking about it. And I suppose what I would say is that no one individual is responsible for racism. No one individual living now created it. But there's an importance of acknowledging that there are benefits that some people in the population have, whereas Black and ethnic minority people perhaps are disadvantaged. And that is something that we need to acknowledge and talk about. And so before matching, I think there's some really important things to think through and to take a really anti-racist approach. So not only just recognizing it, but actually being confident or feeling confident enough to challenge where there are issues that are raised that are uncomfortable or discriminatory, and to learn. And I think that's what our responsibility is as adopters across the board, to maximise our knowledge and understanding and learning. Where it's safe to do so, I think it's really important to promote in-person contact with birth relatives. And I know that there are safety or security issues about that potentially. But if you're wanting to get information about a Black child, then the source and the most accurate source is always going to be from birth family. And I think that sometimes the records and the information that is stored on young people and children's heritage aren't always reliable, aren't always accurate. So it's really important to, when thinking about a child, caring for a child, to try and get as much information as possible. And where workers perhaps say, well, they're African Caribbean, well, what does that mean? Where are their parents actually from? What part of the Caribbean? Because that's going to be information that your child or young person is going to want to know as they get older. And it's something that you can sort of weave into their early years. So I think it's important to sort of encourage and push social workers to give you really accurate information. And if you think that it's the information that you're getting is a bit vague, then by all means ask for more or escalate that if you need to. And I think something that we all benefit from doing is looking at unconscious bias. And for those who've not come across that phrase, it's really those the thoughts that come into your head um, on the basis of some of the messages that we have all sort of absorbed unconsciously around Black people, um, the stereotypes that maybe come to mind. And I think it's not something that is just impacts on white parts of our community. It's something that is built into everyone who watches the media, watches films, reads books. Sometimes you can really get a negative um, impression about some of the stereotypes, and it's you're not aware of it, and systemic racism and organisational discrimination all stems from our unconscious thoughts. It's very often not people's intentions to discriminate. It's those things that sort of happen unconsciously because we're not thinking through why we're making decisions and how we're making decisions. And I've got a couple of books that I'll suggest at the end. Something else I think is really helpful is to learn the history of the Black community in your own area. And I know there's a number of people in the group who come from the States and the UK and probably other areas. So it's helpful to do some research, look at what Black communities are, where they are, and also to try and make links and contacts and friendships if you don't already have them. And I think it's really important that the child, if you are considering transracially adopting, that the child doesn't feel that they are isolated within their family. And certainly my experience was that I think the first person I actually had a conversation with who looked like me was when I was 18, and that's a lot to deal with. And so I think location is really important for families, and I know that there are some families who've considered it and decided to move to somewhere that is much more representative as a community, because they recognise that their child is otherwise going to be quite isolated. And if you're considering transracial adoption, do you have friendships? Do you have networks of Black people who can be a part of, in a realistic way, not in a tokenistic way, but in a realistic way of that child's life, and who can perhaps offer advice, but also help sort of be your person that the child can talk to at a later date. And it's a bit difficult balance because some Black people are unhappy about, and understandably unhappy about, being put in the position of educating you. So you have to tread carefully, but some are willing to sort of offer advice and support and assistance. And it's really helpful if you can do that in a way that perhaps recognises their skills and expertise. And I guess if you have no Black people in your extended network and your family have no Black people in your extended network, then it's worth thinking about whether that is really appropriate for a Black child to be placed transracially in that family if they're not going to have networks. And I guess in my experience, having worked in social care for so long, I don't think agencies ask rigorous enough questions of doctors and foster carers who are offering transracial placements. And so it's important to not just concentrate on getting past panel or your licensing process. It's important to think about what is going to happen to the child in the longer term. It's great when the child's a baby and everyone thinks that they're adorable, or that child's going to grow up into a teenager, which people around you might find more threatening and difficult. And so it's really important to have a safe space for that child. So after placement, what are the sorts of things that have been suggested in terms of maintaining a positive environment for a child or young person? I think images are really important, and making sure that throughout your home, children and young people have images that look like them. They're exposed to a variety of communities, a variety of images, um, and that you're supporting them to attend church or mosque. And that's another sort of area that's really important to talk about to birth family, because they will have views about religion and culture, cultural adherence, and those really need to be respected and followed wherever possible. Um, I think one of the things that I know I feel quite strongly about is the child's name, and there are going to be occasions where it's um, not safe to maintain that name, but otherwise, I think it's really important that they do have the name that their birth family gave them, because really that's one of the only things that's going to sustain into their adulthood that they've had from their birth family. And I think it's tempting sometimes to anglicize names to make them a bit easier to pronounce, possibly, but it's really not appropriate and not helpful for the child. And also, it's a message that children pick up that perhaps they're not quite right, or not quite good enough, or not quite white enough, British enough, American enough. Skin and hair care can be quite an anxiety, and I know from recalling my mum really struggled managing my hair, and I always felt that it was something that was quite negative, because the way she approached it was like, this is something that was difficult, challenging, and it's hard not to take on those messages. And it's helpful where you can to get help if you need it, get training, do courses, um, pay for hairdressers, um, and get support in caring for hair, because I know from my point of view, it's quite it's quite a challenge if you've not been taught how to use different um, products, and where to get them, and which ones are the appropriate ones. Sometimes that can be um, a bit daunting. So I'm thinking, if that's something that people are interested in, then maybe put comments in the group, and we can look at trying to get some expertise around that. Where's the child going to be educated? That's a really, really key issue, because there are some education providers that are very white, very um, not diverse, and that is going to be a challenge, particularly as the child gets older. And it's so important to go somewhere where you see other young people that look similar to you, and also some of the, there's lots of research that indicates that teachers can inform their practice is informed by unconscious bias in terms of stereotyping black students, and perhaps assuming that they can't do things that they absolutely can do. And I've certainly experienced that myself individually, and also with my partner's children, where they were perhaps steered towards sports and um, some of the less academic subjects, rather than um, the more academic, recognizing their academic ability. So choosing a school is really important. Look into it in quite a lot of depth because um, it's balancing those sort of the softer sides, the how are they going to look after the child, how are they going to approach the child, as well as the academic success, because that will stand your child, whatever child, but particularly black children, in better stead if they are academically successful or vocationally successful in terms of getting jobs, because we know that job seeking, there is again some unconscious bias in those sorts of decision making. So adopters have suggested getting involved in the school and helping the school to educate themselves and raising those issues. And I certainly know as as LGBT parents and parents of black children, it's really important to be active in the school, because otherwise their default can be that they just go to the majority pupils, which are quite often white. And even though my children went to a school that was, the pupils were predominantly black, but the teachers were predominantly white, and there were quite a lot of tensions with that. And it was a church school, so that came on with layers of perhaps levels of understanding of difference and diversity. I think one of the other keys is to be open to getting out of your comfort zone. And I think when you're bringing up a child in a transracial placement, then if you're not uncomfortable, then they will be, putting it bluntly. If you're not thinking about putting yourself in situations that maybe don't feel completely natural or comfortable, like going to black areas to get help, to get food, learning a new skill, going perhaps to a black church and putting yourself out there, then it's quite likely that this child is going to feel that the same kind of alienation, but within a wider white environment. We talked about friendships, and one of the other things that was raised by some of the adopters who are currently transracially adopting is that something very, I'm not sure quite what that is in the comments, but right, okay. I don't know how to get rid of that. I will certainly get rid of that afterwards, because that is hugely inappropriate. What other you might find that there are difficult dynamics if you've got other children in the family who might feel excluded from the family, especially if they're white and the black child is adopted, or a stepchild or a strange birth child. And I don't know whether you can see the comment that's been put on here, but I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to come out, I'm going to delete it, and then I'm going to come back in. So bear with me if you would.